So, when people learn I'm a university professor, their first question is typically a professor of what? I usually just respond with higher education, and then they give me a very confused look. I can see that they're thinking, of course, all university professors are professors of higher education, but what do you actually study and teach? Math, biology, English, sociology, etc. So, after regularly experiencing this confused response, now my typical response to that question is to proactively define what I do. So, I'm a professor of higher education, which means basically I study and teach about colleges and universities. It's very meta. And in fact, as you read in the Good Child chapter, there are over 200 graduate level programs across the United States and Canada, as well as others outside of North America, that confer master's and doctoral degrees in higher education related fields and specializations. So, the purpose of this presentation is to give you a deeper understanding of what higher and post-secondary education as a focused field of study encompasses. And as I speak, I encourage you to think about how and where you might see your own scholarly interests fitting into the field. So I want to start this presentation by reflecting on something that Diane Wright and other scholars that you read in this module's readings made a point of emphasizing. So essentially, why is higher education not considered to be a discipline? As those readings discussed, typically disciplines are defined as having a number of specific characteristics. So a general body of knowledge, literature and theory, a specialized vocabulary, some generally understood techniques for testing theories and revising them, generally agreed upon methodologies, as well as techniques for replicating and revising scholarship and research. Higher education scholars have not yet gotten to a point, according to Wright and others, where we can claim that we are a discipline akin to sociology, anthropology, economics, etc. But it's important to think about. So why do we actually need people specifically trained in higher education or other areas of education for that matter, rather than just sociologists, economists, psychologists, etc., who sometimes just study a higher education? And the readings that I assigned as supplemental to this module really underscore how people from the different disciplines approach studying higher education differently from higher education scholars themselves. And it really is a perennial debate because most Americans seem to think that work in education requires common sense more than it does really disciplined knowledge and skill that enables works in other fields. Like, for example, few people think they can design a car or treat a cancer patient without any sort of training, but a lot of smart people think they know what it takes to teach students to read or to help some high school child gain access to college. Mainly because schooling is a common experience, and so that kind of familiarity masks its complexity. But actually, I would like to argue that educational problems are still enduring, and so because of that, maybe we need focused research on problems and solutions in education and in higher education. So most scholars in higher education today, and faculty members such as myself, consider our work to be situated within the field of higher education. Essentially, that means we bring a multi and cross and interdisciplinary approach to thinking about problems in higher education. Basically, we draw from theories, methods, and applications that have been developed not just by those of us who consider ourselves to be higher education scholars and teach in higher education programs and work in higher education administration, but also from people who are working in economics, in psychology, in sociology, in engineering, etc. An interdisciplinary field is really one that crosses traditional boundaries between the academic disciplines and schools of thought as new needs and professional issues have arisen. Sometimes higher education scholars and those of us in the field are critiqued by others in the disciplines by suggesting that our work lacks rigor because we're drawing from multifaceted solutions, but really we've always borrowed methods from other fields. This is a good thing, but it can also be confusing to students in terms of making proper preparation of practitioner scholars really difficult. Our work really, though, is so multifaceted that it really requires myriad approaches and disciplines for broader understanding. Another point I want to make about higher education being a field of study rather than a discipline per se is its true attention to practical application. And this is something that Goodchild discusses in his history of the field. Although he does note that from the mid 1980s onward, former administrators who had been faculty in higher ed programs retired and were replaced by people with PhDs in higher education whose doctoral education and training primarily came from higher education degree programs. So this really, although our research and our professional training is intended to focus on practical application, there has been somewhat of a critique of many higher education researchers, which we'll return to in this module at many points in time, for being disconnected from practical application. But I would contend that that's another attribute of higher education being a field of study rather than a discipline per se. And finally, something else I'd like to mention from the Ball and Forzani article, where they were critiquing educational research in general for being not as focused on the core of what education should be about. And essentially, they were suggesting that K-12 education, but I think it also applies to higher education as well, being a field that really should be focusing on the dynamics and interactions among learners, teachers, the environment, and the curriculum. So rather than researchers just studying students or just studying teachers or just studying the environment or just studying curriculum and content, really educational scholars, educational researchers should be trying to understand all of these entities together and the dynamic relationships among them that constitute really the core of the educational process. And I think this is an important point that higher education scholars should be keeping in mind as well, to try to really understand the dynamics within the sphere of post-secondary education. So we've established that higher education is a broad, interdisciplinary, practice-focused field, but beyond that, our next question is, what exactly is the specific content of the field in higher education? There's three ways that I propose defining the content that's encompassed within our field. And this is just my way of defining it, though, so I encourage you to think of other ways as well. But as I'll discuss, we can think about the content of the field via curriculum that is taught in our graduate programs within higher education, or within just general core knowledge domains that experts in the field have defined, or via topics that are studied by our scholars. As I discuss each of these in a bit more detail, consider what I'm saying critically. So have I left out something that you thought was part of the field? Or think also about how your work, and especially your current research projects, could be situated in each of these different taxonomy. One way to go about defining and organizing what is considered to be part of higher education is to look at what the major topics are that are taught in graduate programs. So the Goodchild chapter did a nice job of summarizing the 5 key areas that graduate programs focus on, and they're up on the screen in front of us. So the first area would be student affairs. So essentially, that's the content that's necessary to prepare professionals who support students outside of the classroom, right? In terms of advising, residential housing, extracurricular programs. They handle conduct and discipline typically, career services, etc. And as Goodchild said in his chapter, certain graduate programs are known to be especially exemplary in each of these different areas. So student affairs, for example, among the best known programs are Bowling Green State University, Iowa State University, and the University of Iowa. The second content area that falls within the umbrella of higher education would be administration. So essentially that encompasses institutional leadership more generally, while student affairs is focused on students' out-of-class experiences. So administration, topics within higher education administration often include budgeting, financial management of colleges and universities, as well as grants, philanthropy, and other institutional fundraising techniques, strategic planning, governance models for post-secondary institutions, state and federal laws that are important to college and university practices, and how to lead and manage educational organizations, and especially work with and supervise staff and faculty. And the program where I earned my PhD, actually, the University of Michigan, is especially well known for its administrative focus. The third group of or topical area within higher education graduate program curricula are administrative issues that are particular to two-year and community college settings. And one of the best known doctoral programs in this area is the University of Texas at Austin. So there are a number of graduate programs that focus particularly on the organization and administration of community colleges. Then the second to last area that is encompassed within the content of higher education, if we look at graduate program curricula, would be the role of policy in higher education. So in contrast to administration, which is more focused on the inner workings and inner management of any given institution, policy is more about how federal and state government shape both institutions as well as individual students. So within policy, specific topics include access to higher education, so policies related to admission, also especially key policy topics within higher education are concerned with funding, including the role of states in subsidizing budgets, federal financial aid, as well as institutional and state financial aid, grants, loans, as well as tax credits. And then finally, also within the content of higher education is particular to how to do research on and assessment of higher education, and especially of students and their outcomes. So as you'll learn throughout this course, actually, there's quite a bit of knowledge around the research process that is particular to higher education. Another way to go about defining and organizing what is considered to be part of higher education as a field of study is to look more intentionally at the knowledge that's considered to be at its center. So while graduate programs have the general foci that I just outlined on the previous slide, Hendrickson's chapter was a proposal around more particulars of the content knowledge. Each of the 5 areas that he identified as being core knowledge domains in the field are listed on the slide here. I'm not going to go over them in ad nauseum detail because he discusses them in the chapter, but essentially he believes that anyone who considers themselves to be a scholar of higher education should have mastery around the history and evolution over time of both individual institutions as well as systems of higher education, so state systems, national systems, etc., as well as the structure and function of organizations, and especially their interplay with the external environment. So how universities interact with policymakers, interact with other agents and external organizations, the K-12 system, etc., as well as organizational theory, which really gets at internal organizational issues to any college or university in terms of political, cultural, social, structural issues that are particular to any given institution, and understanding how and why institutions are organized the way they are. And then also curriculum and learning. So students, the content of the actual institution's learning environment, as well as how students engage in that process both in and out of the classroom. And then finally, issues related to students more broadly and students' development, not just their cognitive development, but other dimensions of their identity and personal development and social development as well. And I think, again, to reiterate, Hendrickson says that fundamental understanding in these 5 areas is essential to analyzing problems and issues in higher education. So as people, as students of higher education, I encourage you to think carefully about your own mastery of each of these knowledge domains and to really push yourself to ensure that you have and are able to understand these different knowledge domains and the problems, and think about problems in higher education through these different, from these different vantage points. Another way to go about thinking or understanding the content that is part of any given field or discipline of study is to investigate and examine what topics that researchers are currently studying. In higher education, there are two main professional associations in the United States that scholars belong to. The first is called the Association for the Study of Higher Education. And the primary activity for this module is for you to actually go to the website of ASH, the Association for the Study of Higher Education, and review their most recent conference program and really look at and think about what are the contemporary issues that scholars are prioritizing. Do you think that there are any gaps existing in terms of what is part of the higher education field of knowledge right now? And then also, how do you think your current interests would fit within the scope of ASH? So the full directions for that activity are in the module website, but I just want to encourage you to do that and really be thinking about how well the topics that ASH scholars are studying are aligned also with the previous content areas that I discussed in this presentation. I also just want to note that the other main professional organization for our field in the United States is AERA, the American Educational Research Association. AERA is actually a P20 professional organization, but there's one division, Division J, which is focused on post-secondary education. So if you have extra time, I also encourage you to go check out AERA's program. It's considerably larger than ASH, given that it's a P20 association. But there's a lot of great information that can be learned from both conferences, and I encourage you to really look into what scholars are doing there. So at this point, I hope that you have a bit of a better understanding about higher education as an interdisciplinary field of study and the kind of content that's typically considered to be within higher education. I want to leave you with these questions that are up on the screen to sort of think more about what is and what is not encompassed in higher education as a field of study, and or what kind of knowledge is on the periphery. I would actually critique our field drawing back to Deborah Ball and Francesca Forzani's article that really we often study just one dimension of the different topics that fall within our sphere rather than really looking at the interactions and processes that are going on, especially as it relates to the learning environment itself and the educational processes that are going on. So that's something where I think our field could do a better job of putting teaching and learning actually at the center rather than focusing so much on other questions. Then I also encourage you to think critically about both how and where you see your current practice as well as your scholarly interests fitting into this interdisciplinary field of higher education, really reflecting on how your work is situated within the field.